speakers who are going to speak on this panel, I think it's fair to say, all have slightly different views of what viable as well as necessary redress would look like in relation to those violations. The first two speakers, firstly we're going to hear from Jen Robinson, and then we're going to hear from Dr. Abdulkarim Lahiji. Jen, as I mentioned right at the start, was absolutely central to the report that we've been talking about today. Jen did a huge number of the interviews that provided the basis of that report. And Jen, I know, is already very familiar to many of you, so she doesn't need a huge introduction from me. But Jen is an international human rights lawyer, currently working at Finers Stevens Innocent. She was previously here at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, where she did her MPhil in law. And Jen was a central figure in a group called Oxford Pro Bono Publico, who've done a huge amount of human rights work here in the UK and much further afield. And it's been great for OTJR to be able to work with Jen on many of those projects in the past. Recently, you probably will have seen her on many of your newspaper front pages as she was involved in the Julian Assange case. She's been involved in a whole range of other very high-profile cases as well. But today she's going to kick off this particular panel looking at issues of recourse and particularly legal redress following the issues that we've talked about on the first panel. So thanks very much, Jen. Live streaming, so.
Yeah. Great. Well, it's with great pleasure that I'm able to address you here today. And to start off, I'd first like to say what a great honour working on this project has been. I had and I say great honour and I mean it wholeheartedly, the great opportunity that was afforded to me to travel both Europe and the US, meeting the victims, many of whom who are here today, the victims of 1988 and the survivors of 1988. Their suffering was humbling, and I think that I'm a different person and a changed person for having heard their stories, heard about their suffering, and celebrate their survival, and the fact that they are here today to be able to tell us their stories and to give us the testimonies which form the basis and help us establish the facts to move forward and to try to seek accountability for the events of 1988. I want to emphasise too the importance of historical documentation and the work of the Abdorrahman Boroumand Foundation. What they're doing is incredibly important. As we set out in the report, and as Jeffrey mentioned when he opened his speech, like him, before I was offered the opportunity to work on this report, I had not heard a thing about what happened in 1988 in the prisons in Iran. It has for too long gone unnoticed and unreported. The mere fact of the bravery and the courage of the victims in coming forward, the work of the survivors, many of whom are here today, for writing their memoirs to document what happened, to have this report and the historical record created by the Abdorrahman Boroumand Foundation is in itself a win and is a solid foundation from which we can move forward and look at legal mechanisms to bring justice and accountability for what took place. I'm going to talk a little bit about, you've all got copies of the report, but I'm going to talk about the legal consequences and the remedies for justice for the victims, but also for the broader Iranian community. The situation in Iran today illustrates the consequences for impunity for crimes against humanity that have never been properly investigated and prosecuted. Some of those perpetrators, those involved in the events of 1988, remain in powerful positions in the judiciary and the state in Iran today, where dissidents continue to be imprisoned and persecuted for being mohareb, warriors against God, in a country where any political opposition to the state is considered or equated with opposition to Islam, or at least that version put forward by the state. So it's my task to summarise for you in less than 10 minutes, given the time restraints, the legal consequences arising from our investigation and the facts established by the very brave testimonies from the victims that we were able to meet with and interview. These legal conclusions, we hope, will serve the basis of international efforts for reparations and for justice. But the mechanisms and efforts by which that might take place will be discussed by my fellow panel members, so I'm going to focus on our legal conclusions in the report. We heard earlier from the panellists in the first session the facts of what took place. So I'll just give you a brief summary. Following the UN ceasefire with Iraq and the failed Eternal Light attack by the Mujahideen in July 1988, Khomeini issued a fatwa which ordered the execution of all Mujahideen prisoners, pursuant to which many thousand MKO were killed. Subsequent to this, there was a second wave of executions in which the leftist prisoners were either killed or tortured, those who were spared death for the religious crime of apostasy. The arbitrary killing and torture of these thousands of men and women in the prisons, proven by the testimonies that we were able to obtain by the very brave victims that offered us those testimonies, exhibit and constitute grave international crimes. They constitute 4 exceptionally serious breaches of what we call Jus Cogens, rules of international law, which entail both state responsibility for Iran and individual responsibility for all of those individuals involved. As you'll see in the report, Mr. Robertson concludes that Iran is responsible for war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide and torture for the events that took place in 1988. Crimes against humanity is a crime established in international law, evidence in the Nuremberg Statute as international law as it stood in 1988, and evidence more recently in Article 7 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. A crime against humanity is constituted by murder or torture and persecution against identifiable groups on political and religious grounds, among others, committed as part of a widespread attack on a civilian population. There is absolutely no question that what took place in 1988 amounts to a crime against humanity. Iranian government policy toward the Mujahideen and the leftists in prisons in 1988 plainly met this definition. In 20 prisons around the country, killing and torture of thousands took place. It was organised and implemented simultaneously in the days after the fatwa on the 28th of July 1988. It was implemented and organised by the death committees, judges and intelligence officers and their prison officials. This crime gives rise to universal jurisdiction under international law, and I'll discuss the consequences of this shortly thereafter. We also conclude in the report that the Iranian state is guilty of genocide in these murders. Now, a distinction is drawn in the report, one that I take issue with, but is a consequence of the international definition of genocide. The killings of both the Mujahideen and the leftists amount to a crime against humanity, there is no doubt of that. But the report questions whether their systematic murder and torture could constitute genocide, at least with respect to the Mujahideen. What is the difference between those two groups? Both groups were arbitrarily killed. Unfortunately, the Genocide Convention creates an obligation on states to investigate and prosecute cases of killings of members of national, ethnic, racial and religious groups with intent to destroy that group in whole or in part. It explicitly excludes political groups. The question then, the threshold question, as to whether it was genocide against the Mujahideen relies upon whether the MKO could be described as a religious group. It is quite clear from the facts that were established that the leftists were executed not for their political beliefs, but for apostasy. Because they were a religious group, those that didn't continue to abide by Islam and commit themselves to Islam, or perhaps best described as an irreligious group. But the clear intent from the fatwa was that all of the Mujahideen ought to be exterminated on the grounds that they were warriors against God, that they were hypocrites, and that they did not subscribe to the version of Islam that the state prescribed. For this reason, we argue that arguably they ought to also be considered as a religious group, because that's certainly how the Iranian regime treated them. They were treated as a religious group by their persecutors. They were maharib, warriors against God. And those who would not repent their hypocrisy, their so-called hypocrisy, and repudiate their deviation from the state version of Islam were killed for their steadfast adherence to a corrupt version of Islam. If you ask me, that is persecution on the grounds of their religious, or as a religious group, or a group that at least adhered to a similar and common belief. Irrespective of that, it is clear that it was a crime against humanity, and certainly genocide with respect to the leftists. We also know that torture was used in a widespread manner against both Mujahideen and leftist prisoners, and in particular against the leftists who avoided the death penalty or extrajudicial killings in July and August and the months that followed. The stories that I heard of the torture in the prisons are probably the most harrowing I have ever come across in my human rights career. People being flogged to the soles of their feet, so badly that they would have no flesh left on their feet, then sent to the infirmary only to receive the medical treatment that would allow them the minimum to be sent back so it could take place again. In one testimony I was told of how after being flogged brutally for hours and hours and days on end, one prisoner was sent to the infirmary to have skin grafted from their thigh to the bottom of their feet so that torture could continue. It is hard to imagine how any court anywhere in the world, perhaps other than Iran, that would not find that that constitutes a severe enough infliction of pain to constitute torture. The prohibition against the use of torture is a rule of customary international law, and again one that gives rise to universal jurisdiction, which means that it can be prosecuted by any state in the world, irrespective of whether it took place on their territory, because it is one, like crimes against humanity and genocide, which the entire international community condemns and seeks to prevent and punish, or ought to, as a matter of international law. All of these three crimes that I've just identified, crimes against humanity, genocide and torture, constitute war crimes when committed in the context of war or in an internal armed conflict, and arguably Iran was in that state after the ceasefire and the war with Iraq. All of the prisoners within prison deserve the protections of the Geneva Conventions as civilians. They were not members of a foreign army, they were not members of the armed attack, they were civilians who were persecuted for their political beliefs. It is very clear from the facts that were established in our report, and on the basis of Mr. Robertson's legal conclusions, that Iran bears responsibility for these grave crimes. Iran as a state does not bear criminal responsibility because it's not possible to bring penal sanctions against a state. It is, however, responsible for the breaches of international law, both treaty and customary law, and it has three obligations arising from the events in 1988. The first is to cease that wrongful activity, and arguably they haven't, by, as we heard from Ladan, ongoing events in Iran today, to make full reparations to the victims, and also to investigate and prosecute those responsible for the crimes. The individuals too bear criminal responsibility and are subject to potential penal sanctions. All of those involved in what happened in 1988, from the supreme leader down to the hangmen involved, could potentially be criminally prosecuted for what happened. But the question is where and how. Certainly Iran under the current regime, there is very little likelihood of that taking place. Perhaps one day, with regime change, we may see some action taken at the domestic level.